in Dramatica, there are some story points called story appreciations, you can also call them story points, which deal with specific aspects, direct aspects of the story structure. And others, which are story points that are once removed, they are built on other story points, from other story points. In other words, that it's not directly referencing the structure, but referencing the cross-impact of a number of story points to create an overall impact. So reach is referred to as an overall appreciation or an overall story point. It's also referred to as an audience story point because it deals specifically with how the structure impacts the audience. What kind of a reach does the structure have into the audience? Well, reach is dealing with whether the audience will empathize or sympathize with the main character. What's the difference between empathy and sympathy? Empathy is when you feel as if you are the main character. Sympathy is when you feel as if you care very much about the main character, but you aren't actually becoming that character in the story. You see, a main character may be someone that you just care about. They're the central figure. You might think to yourself, this is the character whom the story is about. Other main characters, the audience will get right into their shoes and get into the action and feel as if they are that character involved in whatever situation comes up. They will suspend their disbelief, leave their bodies, and occupy that character's position in the story. When you occupy the character's position, that's empathy. When you feel most strongly about that main character, that's sympathy. Now, the intriguing thing about reach is that the Dramatica theory states the reach will not be the same for men and for women in the audience, for those who are male mental sex and female mental sex in the audience. Now, the concept of mental sex comes up. Again, a lot of Dramatica concepts dovetailing. What do we mean by mental sex? Well, it means, does the person who is thinking favor a temporal view, looking at time, looking at how things are balanced, looking at things holistically, looking at how things evolve? Or does someone favor a spatial view, looking at space, looking at how things are connected, looking at the steps that need to be taken? You see, when you take a series of steps in line, although that uses time, that's not really living time. It's breaking time up into steps. But when you feel the flow of things as to how they're evolving, unbroken, that's a more temporal mind. So you might think of it as someone who's primarily linear in their operating system, their thinking, not just consciously, but all the way down to the toes. Or someone who is more holistic and just gets a sense or an intuitive balance for how things work together. An example would be mental sex. A male mental sex character would be Clarice Starling in Silence of the Lambs, or Ripley in the original Alien movie. Each of those characters, although they are female physical sex, think linearly, step by step, not intuitively. Whereas, if you look at The Hunt for Red October, the Alec Baldwin character, Jack Ryan, he deals with things completely from a holistic, intuitive standpoint. He has a female mental sex. Remember, for example, the scene when he's sitting there with all the people around the table with the president's representative and all these generals and the chiefs of staff, and they start talking about one item and another, and suddenly he sits there and he says, "Son of a bitch!" and he shouts it out, and everybody stares at him, and they say, "Hey, what's going on?" And he says, "There's another possibility. Maybe Ramius is trying to defect." And they say, "Where do you get that from?" Well, because he is a holistic thinker, he doesn't just say, "Oh, well, this leads to this, leads to this, leads to this, and that's how I came to that conclusion." He actually has to stop, and in the later part of the class, you'll be able to see a video clip of this in a future class, where he stops and he says, "Well, how do I come to that conclusion?" Well, Ramius is about to retire, and it's the anniversary of his wife's death. And he starts pulling the pieces together, trying to find the little pieces that were in his subconscious that made him come to that conclusion. So, he's actually a female mental sex main character. Now, here's the important thing. Male mental sex audience members, which are primarily men, male mental sex audience members will empathize with a character who is a male mental sex character. So whether it's Ripley or Clarice Starling, that male mental sex audience member will only empathize with another male mental sex main character, and they will sympathize always with a female mental sex main character. And it doesn't matter whether it's Jack Ryan or Nick Nolte in Prince of Tides, another female mental sex character who is male gender. Well, the female audience doesn't do it that way. Male mental sex audience members base it on the mental sex of the main character, empathy, sympathy. But the female mental sex audience members, they base it instead on whether there's a time lock or an option lock in the story. Now, that sounds almost ludicrous, time lock or option lock. Why would a time lock or an option lock be important? Well, for female mental sex, it's sort of 90 degrees out of phase from male mental sex. They're 90 degrees out of phase from each other. In fact, male mental sex sees female mental sex as 270 degrees out of phase. Female mental sex sees male mental sex as only 90 degrees out of phase. But it's that 90 degree or 270 degree relationship that means there's some overlap, but not complete overlap. It turns out that for female mental sex, time and space is the big divider. If it's a temporal story where you're running up against a deadline, for female mental sex they will only sympathize, not empathize. But if it's an option lock story, trying to bring all the options into play and balance things out, then the female mental sex audience member will empathize. Now, that means that if you have a male mental sex main character, and it's in a time lock story, then the male mental sex audience member will definitely empathize because it's male mental sex, but the female mental sex audience member will only sympathize because it's a time lock. And as you can see, there are 4 combinations. The opposite of that would be to have a female mental sex character and also have an option lock. In that case, then the female mental sex audience members will empathize, and the male mental sex audience members, they will only sympathize because it's a female mental sex main character. The other 2 combinations give you one in which both empathize and both sympathize. And that's what audience reach is all about. By creating a dramatic structure, it allows you to then predict whether the men or the women in your audience will empathize or sympathize with the main character. And that kind of story form can help determine what kind of merchandising you have, what kind of a draw you will have, and whether one part of the audience or the other part of the audience will feel more involved in the story in a personal sense. Now, we say a lot more about this later on in the class that actually covers mental sex, but for the time being, we need to carry it a step farther because that just describes reach, and the question was, how does reach relate to reception theory? Well, reception theory is about how an audience receives what they see on the screen or read in the book. It's where the audience becomes proactive, trying to analyze the symbols they see in front of them, both subconsciously and intuitively, and also logistically, trying to figure out what does this mean, emotionally and logistically. Now, when you're writing for an audience, you are in the reception stage. All the other stages of storytelling are before that. So when you write for an audience, that's when you have to start thinking, what's the audience bringing to the process? What buzzwords do they know? What experiences have they had? Do they already know this character from a previous story? So that's where you end up with yourself in the writing process, in reception. So one of the things you have to concern yourself with when you're writing in reception is what's going on in your audience in terms of empathy and sympathy. So in terms of, does reach have any impact on reception? The answer is yes. When you're dealing with the reach of audience empathy or sympathy for male and female audience members, depending on who you're trying to reach as an author, you must bring that into consideration at the reception stage where you're actually doing the writing and considering what the audience is bringing to the process.